Hey, what's up everybody? My name is Moss, and in this video I'm going to give you a quick introduction to gRPC using the Go programming language. gRPC is Google's implementation of the RPC protocol, and in this video we're going to write a very simple RPC service using gRPC. And I'll walk you through implementing a Unary gRPC service method. In later videos we'll expand our gRPC service definition to include additional service methods. Before we get started though, you should have completed the prerequisites. I expect that you're already somewhat familiar with the concept of remote procedure calls. In this tutorial, I'll be using protocol buffers, so I expect that you already have proto-C installed on your machine. In addition to proto-C, you'll also need to install the proto-C plugins that allow proto-C to automatically generate code in the Go programming language. In order to fulfill the installation requirements, I've linked to a quick start guide in the video description below. If you haven't already, go ahead and grab a coffee and let's get started. Okay, so first I want to give a little context around the service that we're about to write. It's going to be a very simple user management service where a client can send a request to the user management service to create a new user, and the user management service will create that user and essentially send the created user details back to the client. The initial functionality of the user management service will be limited to just creating users, but in future videos we'll expand that functionality to include other service methods. So now let's take a look at the directory structure of the user management service. In the project's root directory, I have 3 subdirectories. The first is user management, and inside of user management we'll store our service definition inside of the proto file. And we'll also store the Protobuf files that are automatically generated from compiling this proto file using proto-C. In the user management client directory, we will store the client code, and then in the user management server directory, we will store our server code. And the first thing that I want to do before writing the service definition is initialize a new Go module. So I'm going to open up my terminal here and I'll say go mod init example.com / and we'll call it Go user management gRPC. So now we can begin writing the service definition in the user management proto file, which I already have open. And inside of the proto file, I'll first declare the syntax as using proto 3. So we'll be using version 3. And then we're going to declare the user management package. And then I'm going to specify an option. Go package is equal to the name of my module. So this is going to be example.com / go user management gRPC semicolon go user management gRPC. And after specifying that option, we can start defining the service. So I'm going to say service user management. And the user management service will have, for now, only a single service method. And that service method will be for creating new users. And to declare that service method, I'll just say RPC, and then I'll call it create new user. And then we need to specify the input for the service method. And the input is going to be a new user. And a new user is just going to be a message type that contains that new user's details. Specifically, we're going to include name and age of that user. Then we need to specify what this service method returns when it gets a create new user request. So what it should return is the generated user's details, which will include the name and age, but also include a user ID that is generated by the server. And we'll define that as user and close out the service method. So in the service method, we've defined new user as input and user as the output of the create new user service method. But we haven't actually defined new user or user. So to do that, we need to define a new message in this service definition. And the first message that we will define is new user. And as I mentioned before, a new user will only contain a couple of details about the new user. Specifically, it will contain a string, which is the name of the user, and then it will also include the age of the user, and we'll define that as a 32-bit integer. And then the last message that we need to define is the user message. So I'll define a new message down here, and we'll call it user. And this will also contain the name of the user, as well as the age. And then what we'll do on the server side is we'll generate a random ID, essentially representing that user's unique ID in the database. Okay, so this will also be a 32-bit integer, and we'll call it ID. And now that we've defined new user and user messages, that basically completes our service definition. And remember that this create new user service method is an example of a Unary service method where the server receives a single request and returns a single response. And with our service now defined, we can generate the protobuf files using the proto compiler program. So in my terminal, I'm going to invoke proto-c along with several options. And the first option is going to specify the out directory of the first protobuf file. And that option is going to be --go_out equals, and then we'll specify the user management directory. Actually, we'll specify current directory because we're going to specify a second option that will generate the files relative to the source, and the source being the user management.proto file. Okay, so the second option here is going to be go_opt equals paths equal source relative, and then we'll also specify for the second protobuf file, the gRPC protobuf file, we'll specify the out directory for that file as well by using --go-grpc_out equals current directory. And then we'll specify --go-grpc_opt equals paths equals source relative. Okay, and then finally we just need to specify the directory where the proto file is stored. Okay, and I got an error from that command, so it looks like I'm missing a semicolon. So let's take a look, and I'm missing a semicolon after declaring the syntax. Okay, and then I'm also missing a semicolon after line 5 as well. And I just noticed that I think this isn't declared correctly, so these should be go_user management_grpc. Okay, so let's try that and see if it generates the files correctly. And it looks like it did generate the protobuf files. You can see under the user management folder. Now we have a user management_grpc.pb.go, and we also have a user management.pb.go. The user management.pb.go file is provides the logic for serializing and unserializing the messages that we defined in the service definition. In the user management_grpc protobuf file includes the generated client and server code that we need to implement in our own client and server programs. So once we've generated these protobuf files, we can then begin writing our client and server code to implement the functions that we defined in the proto service definition file. So let's first start by writing the user management server. And I've already created a file for the user management gRPC server. It's called usermanagement_server.go, and I've placed that under the user management_server subdirectory. I'll navigate to the user management server file, and we will define package main, and then we'll begin our import statements. So we're going to import context. We'll import log. Then we'll import math rand so that we can generate random integers that will be used as the user IDs. And then we'll import net. After that, we'll import the Protobuf module, and that's going to be example.com go-usermanagement-grpc/user management. And the final module will be gRPC, so that will just be .golang.org/grpc. And after our import statement, we're going to set a single constant variable. So I'll set that now, and that will be the port that the gRPC server is going to run on. So port equals, in this case, we'll set it to a very high port number, 50,051. And after defining the port, we'll then define a new type, and this type is going to be called user management server. And inside of the user management server, we will embed Protobuf unimplemented user management server. So this user management server is our implementation of the gRPC service, and to register this type with gRPC, we have to embed the unimplemented user management server inside of the type. And besides that, we don't really need to do anything else with the user management server. So we can begin defining our service method that we defined in the proto file. And remember, in the proto file, we defined this RPC service method, create new user. So now we're going to implement that as a receiver function in the user management server file. So here I will define a new function with a receiver pointer of type user management server, and it will be called create new user. And it will take as input a context as well as a Protobuf new user. Okay, just like we defined in the proto definition, the service definition, the input is a new user, a Protobuf new user. Okay, and then as we define in the service definition, it will return a pointer to a Protobuf user and an error. And the first thing that we're going to do in this function is simply log the name of the new user that we received from the client. And to do that, I'll invoke log.printf, and then we'll say received. And then we will reference the input Protobuf new user, and we'll invoke one of the auto-generated functions. In this case, we'll invoke getName, which will return the name of the input new user. Okay, so this should return the name of the new user that was passed to us by the client. The next thing that we want to do is define a new variable, and we're going to call it user_ID, and it will be of type int32. And we're going to generate a random integer, and it will be assigned to that user as the user's unique identifier. Okay, so I'll invoke rand dot int, and then we'll say out of 1,000, just to make it sort of unlikely that we'll have a collision with another user ID in this small use case. And then I'm going to cast this as an 32-bit integer. And then finally, we will return a Protobuf user, and we'll define it in line here. So I'm going to reference the address, and then we'll say pb.user. And the first attribute that we have to define is the name of the user, and we'll actually just reference the input, the name of the input new user. So this is going to be in.getName, and then we'll define the age, and again we can reference the input Protobuf new user. So I'm going to say in.getAge, and finally we'll set the user ID, which was generated by the server. So this is going to be ID, and then user underscore ID, and then we'll also return nil. And that's all we really need inside of our create new user function. So we can define our main function. So I'm going to go down here and define a new main function. And the first thing that we're going to do in the main function is utilize the net.listen function to begin listening on the port that we specified up here, 50,051. Okay, so I'll define two new variables, and then I will invoke net.listen, and then pass in the port. Then we'll check if net.listen returns an error. So if error is not equal to nil, we will log a fatal message. Along with the error. And after we check the error, we will define a new variable, s for server, and we will invoke the new server function from the gRPC module. So I'm going to say gRPC dot new server, and after we initialize this new server, we are going to register the server as a new gRPC service. Okay, and to do that, we'll invoke protobuf.register user management server, and we're going to pass in s, and then we'll also pass in the address to the user management type. And then we will log that the server is listening on localhost. So I'm going to do log printf, and then server listening at lis.address. And finally, we'll start the server by invoking s.serve. So I'll say if error equals s.serve, and error is not equal to nil, then we'll log a fatal message here. And that wraps up all of the code that we need to write for our gRPC server. And now we can go ahead and write the client code. So I'm going to navigate to the user management underscore client file. And the first thing that we're going to do is define package main, and then we will define our imports. So imports, and then first will be context, and then log. We'll also import time, and then we'll import our Protobuf module. So that'll be pb, and then I'll just copy it from the server here. And actually, you know what, we'll copy that entire lines 9 and 10 there, since they'll be the same. And after we define the imports, we'll set a new constant variable. And this is going to be the address of the gRPC server, which will be hosted at localhost and then port 50,051. And after defining that constant, we can begin writing the main function. So this is going to be func main. And the first thing that we're going to do in the main function is dial a connection to the gRPC server. So I'm going to define two new variables here, connection and error. And I will invoke the gRPC function dial. And we'll pass in first the address of the server, and then we'll specify insecure connection. So insecure, and then grpc.with block. Okay. And the with block option simply means that this function will not return until the connection is made. So this will be a blocking call to dial. We'll then check if there was an error. So if error is not equal to nil, log.fatal did not connect. Error. And then we will defer connection close. And now using that connection, we'll create a new client. We'll call it C equals protobuf.new user management client. Okay. And we'll pass our connection to that function. After that, we'll define a new context. And we'll invoke context with timeout. And we will invoke context.background and then time in seconds. All right, and then we'll defer cancel. And then what we'll do is hard code a couple of new users that we will provide as input to the create new user function for our gRPC service. So I'm going to first define a new users map. And I'll invoke make and then map with a key of type string and a value of 32-bit integer. And then let's create the users inside of this map. So the first user will be Alice, and we will set their age to be 43. And then the second user we'll call Bob, and their age will be 30. And once we've defined those new users, we'll then call the create new user function by looping over the new users map. So I'll say for name and age in range new users. I'm going to define two variables here, R for the response from the gRPC server, and then error equals client.create new user, and then we'll pass in the context, and then we'll pass in the address of a new protobuf new user. Okay, and then the name will be the name key from the map, and then age will be the value from the map. After we call the function, we'll check if there's an error. So if error is not equal to nil, we'll log.fatal f could not create user, and then error. Otherwise, if there wasn't an error, then we'll print the user details that we received from the gRPC server to the console using log. Okay, so I'll say log.printf, and then I'll actually use backtick so that this can be a multi-line statement. User details, and then name, and that'll be a string. Age, and then ID. Okay, and then we'll pass in the response. So we'll say r.get name. So r should be a user that was passed back. That should be the user message that was passed back from the server. Remember that in the proto file we defined the return type to be of type user, user message, right? So we should get back the name, age, and then the generated ID of the user. Okay, so I'm going to reference, I'm going to invoke the get name function of that user, and then I'll also invoke the get age, and then finally we'll invoke get ID. And I'm going to set these like that, okay? And then I'll also do a back tab here, okay, so this prints out correctly. And that should be all we need for our client code. So let's first install the modules that we imported in the server and client code, and then we'll run the program. So in the terminal, I'm going to invoke go mod tidy, and it's going to download all of the packages, all of the modules that we imported in our code. And the first program that we want to run is, of course, the gRPC server. So I'm going to invoke go run, and then user management underscore server, and then user management server, and then let's run the program. And it looks like it's working correctly. It says server listening at localhost 50,051. And in a second terminal, I'll invoke the client program. So I'll open a second terminal, and I will say go run user management client, and then the client program, and let's see if this runs correctly. And it looks like I have a syntax error on line 5, so let me take a look here. And it looks like I imported gRPC here at the top, and then I also added an S there for the import statement, which was unnecessary. Okay, so let's try and rerun that client program again and see what happens. This time it looks like the client ran, and if I expand the terminal out, I get the user details message back from the gRPC server as we intended, and it prints out that new user's details, including the user's ID. So the ID of the first user, Alice, is 81, and then we have 887 for new user, Bob. So as you can see, it's not too difficult to set up a simple gRPC service. In our case, we only have a single Unary service method, but we could expand this user management service a lot further. And I'd like you to brainstorm additional service methods that we could create for this user management service, because in future videos that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to expand the functionality of this user management gRPC service. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something following along with the tutorial. And if you did, please consider throwing a like on the video and subscribing to the channel for more videos like this. I'd also like to point out that all of the code that we wrote today is available in a GitHub repo that I've linked in the video description below. Hopefully I'll see you in the next video, and thanks for watching.